So I'll admit, I'm a bit new to this Reddit thing, but one of my kids pointed me to it, telling me I should talk about some of the things that happened to me back when I was still serving. I spent some time reading a few stories on here, and I'll admit, it got me thinking back to the old days when I still worked in that backwater town. So bear with me now. I'm a cop by trade and no writer, but I'll do the best I can. The first story that really springs to mind was my first particularly strange experience in a summer of '69. This was before I became sheriff. I'd been a cop in Goody for about a year or so. Now, Goody was a small town up in northwest Maine, no more than about 800 souls living there while I was stationed. I say was because if you go up there today about 10 or 12 miles east of Jackman, all you'll find is a bulldozed over plot. State bought the city for development of something or other and then funding up and dried out. But that's a whole other story, and I'm getting sidetracked. So I was a young cop, or more of a deputy really, since there were all but 4 of us in the station back then. It was me, Christian Woods, Mackey, and Sheriff Young. I remember it perfectly well. It was early Sunday morning, a little before folks were getting up for Mass, when Sheriff Young knocked on my front door. I lived in a small one-room house, basically a refurbished log cabin on the outskirts of town from when the Pilgrims first came, and I can assure you, I was not yet up for church. When I answered the door, Sheriff Young was staring at me with his usual sour look and told me to get my pants and my gun. Before I could ask what was going on, he'd already turned-heeled back to his pickup. I guess I should talk a bit about Sheriff Young. Despite the name, he was an old, mean, dried-up son of a bitch. But no one in town respected him more. His word was law, and he spoke it well. He'd been sheriff of Goody for about 30-odd years, and never once had I seen him break composure. That's why I knew something was wrong when I sat next to him in his truck and halfway down the dirt road, he'd stuck a cigarette between his cracked lips and forgotten to light it. Eventually we pulled onto Main Street, then off it again. And that's when I figured out where we were going, the Paulson House. The Paulson House was one of the newer houses in Goody, built only 10 years ago on Crossin Hill by, you guessed it, the Paulson family. Some rich city types come out to Goody to get away from it all. I shouldn't say that, actually. There were good folks. When we pulled up the gravel driveway, Mackey and Christian Woods were already there, talking to a frantic Mr. and Mrs. Paulson. They were a mess. Mr. Paulson was halfway into his Sunday best and his wife was still in her nightgown. Both were wide-eyed and frantic, like they'd seen a ghost. I didn't see where their daughter was. Cindy, I think. Anyways, when we pulled up, the conversation was going something like this. "Get in there and do something. My baby girl is sick." Mrs. Paulson was screaming at Mackey. Poor Mackey looked totally overwhelmed. "Get in there and do something about my daughter. She's not right. We need a doctor or a..." That was about when Sheriff Young interrupted, and Mrs. Paulson went real quiet. He told Mr. and Mrs. Paulson to wait outside, then gestured for the 3 of us to follow him inside. We entered the house like it was a tomb. "What's going on, Sheriff?" I asked. "Is something wrong with Cindy?" Sheriff Young stopped halfway up the stairs and stared at me with his icy blue eyes. "Best you see yourself," he said flatly. We went down the upstairs hall and into Cindy's bedroom. It struck me as a typical rich 17-year-old girl's room. Posters of the Beatles, The Who, and so on and so forth. Fancy closets full of fancy clothes, and a double bed all for herself, frills and all. Would have been perfectly normal if it wasn't for the fact that Cindy Paulson was lying flat as a board 2 feet above her bed. Yeah, you heard me right. I had to blink 3 times and kiss my cross before I could believe it. Cindy Paulson was floating above her bed, her arms flat against her sides and her eyes staring straight up at the ceiling. Mackey shoved past the lot of us, running straight towards Cindy Paulson as if he was going to pull her down. Sheriff Young stopped him cold. "Nobody lay even a finger on her," he snarled. We cowered like dogs. Last person we'd heard Sheriff Young talk like that to ended up with a bullet in the head. Cindy Paulson, this is Sheriff Young," he said slowly. "Can you hear me?" Cindy Paulson didn't say a word, She just kept on floating. He asked again, "Cindy, if you can hear me, blink your eyes or move your fingers." I strained to get a look at her face. It sent a chill down my spine. Her face was like a picture of someone you'd scared jumping out of a closet, the moment between being unaware and screaming. It was like any moment she would open her mouth and holler at the top of her lungs. Her eyes were wide and afraid. We huddled in the doorway as Sheriff Young picked up the chair at her desk and prodded her with it like he was taming a lion. Cindy didn't even move. She was totally frozen in place. That was until Christian Woods spoke up. "Sir, she's going up." He was right. You couldn't tell from far away, but up close, Cindy Paulson was slowly but surely floating upwards towards the ceiling. I felt my stomach go ice cold. Sheriff Young barked his orders. We ran down to the trucks, grabbed all the straps we had on hand, and ran back upstairs, ignoring Mr. and Mrs. Paulson as they begged to know what was going on. By the time we got back, Cindy was now 3 feet above her bed. We tossed 2 straps across her, one on her chest and one on her stomach, and we all took an end and started to pull. Little Cindy Paulson was built like a twig and no more than 5'6", but it was like trying to pull down a barn rafter. It was unthinkable. The 4 of us pulled and grunted and tried to force her back down to the bed, but the harder we pulled, the harder she seemed to resist. That's when I first heard it. It sounded like the whine of a beaten dog, low and piercing, but constant, like it was coming from a siren. "It's her," whispered Christian Woods, his eyes wide. Cindy's mouth, before closed in a silent scream, was open, only slightly. That terrible whining sound was coming from inside her throat. She was starting to rise faster. "Pull harder, for fuck's sake," screamed Sheriff Young. "Cindy, can you hear me? You're gonna be all right. We've got you." Sweat poured down my brow, and my entire body was shaking as we pulled. It was impossible. Every second, Cindy was floating higher, and the whining in her throat was growing louder and shriller. Her face was contorting, but her body still paralyzed. She was screaming. Then Mr. and Mrs. Paulson came barging into the room, and they started screaming too. Mrs. Paulson fell to the ground, crying and wailing, and Mr. Paulson helped us pull, his face bright red. "My baby! No, God, please, don't take my baby!" "Cindy Roberts Paulson, this isn't funny, young lady. You stop it. You stop it right now," hollered Mr. Paulson, tears and sweat streaming down his face. "Sheriff, she's gonna hit the ceiling," cried Christian Woods. The whole time the screaming was getting louder and louder until we could barely hear ourselves think. Then suddenly it went quiet, muffled. We looked up. Cindy Paulson didn't hit the ceiling. She was going through it. Mrs. Paulson screamed again, and I still hear it in my dreams. Pure horror and grief and agony. "Attic!" Sheriff Young ordered, but I was already on my way. As soon as I went up the stairs and opened the attic door, I nearly went deaf from Cindy's scream. I can still see it. Jesus. Her face half sticking out of the floorboards, the wooden planks inside of her screaming mouth. She screamed, and her face was sheet white. In less than a minute, her whole body was inside the attic. Then she started melting through the roof. I rocketed down the stairs, and Mr. Paulson was already racing outside. Sheriff Young ordered me to follow. Mackie stood dumbfounded. The straps in his hands were cut clean through. By the time we got outside, Cindy Paulson was 10 feet above the house, still frozen and screaming. She was climbing faster and faster, and Mr. Paulson was begging and weeping and cursing the entire time. He fell to the ground and clawed at his head in grief. The rest of us just stared, totally numb, as Cindy Paulson rose into the sky faster and faster until her screaming was gone and she disappeared into the clouds. Whole thing was over in 10 minutes. The weather that day was about 85 Fahrenheit, but not one of us wasn't shivering like a leaf. About an hour later, Mr. and Mrs. Paulson were finally able to talk in complete sentences, and we sat them outside. Sheriff Young barely said a word, staring off into the woods with cigarette in hand, but he was shaking. We all were. Meanwhile, Mackie tried to comfort the parents, and Christian Woods was talking of search and rescue and helicopters and the National Guard. What good that would do, I didn't know. How do you search for a 17-year-old girl who just flew up into the sky? But we still told them we'd do everything we could to find their baby girl. That is, until we heard the rain. First, it was slow, steady, a pitter-patter on the roof. We ignored it at first. Then it came louder, faster, and we realized it wasn't raining on us at all, and the skies were mostly clear. I turned and looked up. In the exact spot Cindy Paulson had risen up into the sky, a shower of thick, dark blood was pouring from the clouds and splattering onto the roof. It fell for about 30 seconds, soaking the tiles and running down the gutters. Then it stopped, and all that was left behind was blood dripping from the roof and the screaming of the Paulsons. We never found out what happened to Cindy Paulson, nor did we ever see her again. Sheriff Young told us never to speak of what happened that summer morning at the Paulson house ever again, not to anyone. I asked Sheriff Young if this had ever happened before. He didn't answer. I don't think it ever had. I didn't get much sleep that night, terrified that I'd wake up and be floating 2 feet above my bed in the morning. The next morning, when I talked to Mackie, he told me something that stuck with me. Maybe God called Cindy Paulson to heaven, but he didn't like what he saw. Now, Mackie was a bit of a slow boy, but a good kid, so I didn't know what to think of that. Part of me hopes he was right, because within a month, both Mr. and Mrs. Paulson got called to heaven by God from the Paulson house, and he didn't like them either. The Paulson house has stood empty ever since. I'm staggered by the response from all of you kind people. It's been a long time since I told anyone about my time in Goody, so I never expected folks to be interested by these dusty old stories. It does me some good to talk about it again. Goody was a strange place, and some of the things I've seen there were worse than others. Some folks used to say the town itself was cursed since the day it was founded. I'm not sure about that, but Goody definitely wasn't a good place to be. Anyway, this particular story happened in the fall of the same year as the last story, around late September. I was off duty, if I remember correctly, and picking up some groceries from Hobson's. Hobson General was the only grocery store in Goody, and though they didn't have much of the things I was used to eating before Goody, there were plenty of fresh vegetables and whatnot to keep you eating right. The store was run by Jerry and his son, Jerry Jr. God rest them both. The two were like literal peas in a pod, lanky and lean with a long face. They were good folks and gave a fair deal, and they were some of the most accommodating folks in all of Goody. Helped me stock my pantry when I first moved in at a discount, so I owed them. Jerry generally ran a lot of errands out of town, leaving his son to man the store. That day I was alone in the shop, picking up some eggs and milk and whatnot. I stopped at the counter to pay and chat with Jerry Jr. I noticed that he didn't seem to have his usual pep. "You getting enough sleep?" I asked him. He nodded, then shook his head with a dismal smile as he bagged my groceries. "No, sir, not as of late. Been having some trouble sleeping recently. That damn old train keeps waking me up at all hours of the night. Can't get a wink." I nodded sympathetically, told him to get some rest, and headed back to my car. Now here's the thing about Goody, Maine. If you'll allow me to go off track for a moment, no pun intended. Long before I showed up, Goody was actually a fairly decent hotspot for lumber, and a company by the name of Manning Coal and Lumber bought a lot in the town. To get the lumber out and about Maine and the USA, they connected Goody to the railway system there, building a train station and a track. It was probably the most modern thing Goody had seen since the horse and carriage. So point is, there was a railway crossing alongside Goody, parallel with Main Street and off by half a mile. Problem is, when I met up with Christian Woods a day or so later and brought it up to him, he gave me the strangest look. He'd told me that Manning had gone under in 1932, and that not a train had run on that line in over 30 years. I was confused, but pretty quickly shrugged it off. I assumed Jerry Jr. was using some Goody saying that I'd never heard of, and I had bigger things on my plate anyway. Goody was a small town and everybody knew everybody, but that didn't mean that we were at a loss for things to do. We were working on a missing persons case that was turning up more and more confusing leads as we dug, and I was also racking my brain trying to figure out the beautiful young woman working at the bakery to join me for dinner. To top all that off, Jerry had come to us complaining that someone had been stealing coal from the back of Hobson's. Meanwhile, Jerry Jr. was just getting worse. I saw him about 2 weeks after I'd last spoken with him. I was heading up to Hobson's with Mackie, since he was always nervous to do his shopping alone when he was picking up groceries for his mama. When I walked through the door, I did a double take. Jerry Jr. was always a thin kid, but what I saw was terrible. Jerry Jr. had bags under his eyes that dug so deep it made his eyes sink into his skull. They peered out from under his brow, bloodshot and worn. Every breath he took seemed ragged, like he barely had the strength to open his lungs. When I got to the counter and looked down, he quickly hid his hands from me. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I asked carefully. Jerry Jr. mumbled a reply and took my money without looking. I bent my head to try to look him in the eyes. "You all right?" Again, no answer. He stared at the register like it was two-headed cow. "Now, Jerry Jr., I started again. His eyes went wide, maddeningly wide, and he spun to look at me. "It's that goddamn train, sir," he mumbled, feverish. "It can't keep doing this. You gotta do something. I can't sleep. Every night it keeps getting worse. I can't stay. I need to go. I need to get on board. I need to get on the train or it won't stop." At this point, I was starting to get scared. Jerry Jr. was gibbering and drooling like a madman, insisting that this train was passing every night, each time louder and closer. He told me he could hear the steam in the boilers and the shouting of the conductor. Mackie fidgeted nervously behind me. "Jerry Jr., I said slowly, "show me your hands." Like a scolded child, Jerry Jr. put his hands on the counter. His hands' wrists were blackened and chafed, and his fingers ragged raw to the bone. Now, technically in Goody, we couldn't really force anyone to go see a doctor, but when Sheriff Young phoned Jerry and told him to take his son to see Dr. Lautner, he was there the next day, especially after we told him we'd found our suspected coal thief. You can probably guess that Goody, Maine didn't have a hospital. In fact, the closest one was probably a good 2 hours drive away. All we had was Dr. Lautner's clinic. He was a good man and doctor, but a drinker, though I didn't know it at the time. Mackie and I drove down to the clinic after getting a call from Jerry, telling us his son was all right. Dr. Lautner was going to keep him overnight for observation. When we pulled up, the doctor was having a beer in his office and invited us to join him. Mackie stuck with apple juice as we shot the shit. He couldn't tell us much about Jerry Jr. on account of the whole hippo-something rule, but what he could tell us was bad. He told us that Jerry Jr. was seriously exhausted and that the fatigue was affecting him physically and mentally. He kept raving about a train and how it kept him up at night, how he needed to get on board, totally beyond reason. The doctor didn't have the resources for a mental evaluation, but he assured us that a good night's rest would solve all his problems. Did I say Dr. Lautner was a good doctor? More like decent, actually. Anyway, we were about 2 or 3 beers in when we heard shattering glass. The conversation paused, and we listened intently. It came again, regular and constant. It was coming from inside the clinic. I unholstered my Model 10 and followed Dr. Lautner down the hall. The sound was coming from inside the room Jerry Jr. was being kept. I slowly opened the door. The room was ransacked. Broken bottles with pills and disinfecting alcohol were shattered and tossed about the room. Jerry Jr. was on his hands and knees, rambling incoherently. He was surrounded by everything from bandages to mugs to garbage. I watched as he grabbed a big handful of the items on the floor, gouging his fingers on the floorboards in the process. Then, without looking, he threw them inside an open cabinet beside him. He kept tossing and scooping like a madman. He never looked up. Blood splattered onto the cabinet as the bandages on his fingers ripped and fell apart. Mackie quickly grabbed Jerry Jr., pulling his arms back as Dr. Lautner scrambled to prepare a sedative. As soon as Mackie stopped his ritual, Jerry Jr. completely lost it. I saw his eyes. They were gaunt and hollow, rolled back into his skull. He opened his mouth and screamed, bloody and furious, thrashing in Mackie's grip. Before I knew it, I was aiming my piece at the boy. He was 17 and skeletal, but he was fighting like a caged tiger, and even Mackie was having trouble keeping him in check. It was like the devil himself was burning his insides. He bit down on Mackie, and he let go. Turning to face us, Jerry Jr. spit something on the ground. It was a chunk of Mackie's arm. "It's here," he screeched. "I have to get on board. I can't take it anymore. I have to know." He leaped at us, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Like toys, he knocked us aside and sprinted out the clinic. I felt a pinch on my arm, and Dr. Lautner mumbled an apology. The idiot had accidentally stuck me. Well, I told Mackie to stay put and got on the radio, hollering for backup before taking chase. I'd lost sight of Jerry Jr., but I had a pretty good idea where he was going. I heard Mackie shout, "Don't hurt him!" as I ran out the clinic. He hurtled through the underbrush, twigs snapping behind him. Now, I was in pretty good shape back then, minus the sedative that was starting to make my arm go numb. But I could hardly keep up with him. It was like his legs weren't his. They were taking steps too long, stretching too far, windmilling like the axles of a train car, and the howling. Dear God, he was whooping and hollering and speaking in tones that weren't possible for a kid like him. Eventually I lost him in the woods but stuck on his trail. The night was freezing, unnaturally so, and the moon shined on us like a spotlight. When I broke the tree line, I realized that besides the howling in the distance and my own breathing, there wasn't a sound to be heard. I found Jerry Jr. where I expected to, the old train station. During the day, it was a wreck of faded wood and cracked paint, but on that night it looked like a gloomy sinner's steeple. I'll admit this next part is a bit hard for me to write. See, unlike with the Paulson house, I was alone at the train station when it happened. I can't explain what I saw, but I still think about it from time to time. It's hard, and I'd be lying if my eyes were wholly dry right now. But I'll try to describe as best as I can what I saw when I pulled my gun out with one hand and trained it on Jerry Jr. He was standing on the tracks, and I mean that quite literally. He was splayed with a leg on either rail, his arms stretched out in a V. It looked like he was praying, like in some weird prayer. "I hear you, I'm here, I'm on time, please don't leave without me, I have to know," he was screaming. He didn't even look at me as I crept up to him. "Listen, son, I know you're not all right, but you need to listen to me, okay? You're sick. I'm gonna get you some help. You just need to come with me." "You don't understand. It's coming. I can't miss it again, or I'll never know. I have to get on board." "There's no train, son. There hasn't been for 30 years. I was starting to feel funny, and it wasn't just the sedative in my right arm. You know how cats and dogs are supposed to feel earthquakes before they happen, like a vibration that we can't feel? It was something like that. "I know," screamed Jerry Jr. He turned his head. In the moonlight, I saw tears streaming down his gaunt face. "I know, oh please God, I know, but I have to know. It won't stop. I have to get on board." Mackie's words came back to me, and I slowly put my gun on the ground as I edged closer to him. "It's gonna be all right, son. Think of your daddy. I gotta take you home to him." The feeling was getting more intense. The hairs on my neck were on end, and it felt like the wind was picking up, running parallel to the tracks. In the soles of my boots, I felt a vibration, and I could have sworn I heard a horn. "Just come off the tracks, Jerry Jr.," I told him, offering my hand. "I'm here. I'm gonna take care of you. I promise. Gonna get you back to your daddy." The vibration grew stronger. The wind whistled harder, and the horn got louder as I got closer. In my neck, I felt something like eyes burning into me from the train station. I didn't look. I kept my eyes trained on Jerry Jr. They were the eyes that I remembered from Hobson's now. The eyes of a boy just scared and confused. "Please," he sobbed. "It wants to take me, but I don't want to go." I was only a foot away. His hand... Lord, I almost had his hand in mine. The horn blared, nearly bursting my eardrums. Little Jerry Jr. One moment, he was there on the track, only a foot away. The next, he exploded in a red mist. When I came to a moment later, he was gone. Nothing to be done. I like to think he never felt a thing. Sheriff Young and Christian Woods found me beside the tracks, splattered in blood and bits of bone. In my hand, I was clutching Jerry Jr.'s arm. Talking to Jerry was the first time as a cop I'd had to tell a parent that their child was gone before them. It's the hardest goddamn thing to do in this business. That night, I prayed to the bottle, because it was hard to think that God would answer a single word. What haunted me is that before we left the tracks that night, I touched the rail where Jerry Jr. died. It was burning hot, as if a train had just passed. This next story is actually a bit of a time skip, so apologies that not everything is totally chronological. Forgive an old man his rambling. I was scratching my head trying to think of which story to talk about next. I mentioned in my last story that we were working on a missing persons case while Jerry Jr. was having his breakdown, so I thought I'd talk about that. This missing persons case actually goes back to before even the Paulson House incident. In fact, it was one of the first real assignments I took on after becoming an officer in Goody. It was maybe 2 months after I'd gotten settled into town, just starting to get used to the people and the strange rules Goody had, rigorously enforced by Sheriff Young. I was walking down Main Street one evening, having a chat with a charming elderly woman named Susanna about the weather and this and that, trying to get a better feel of the townsfolk in an effort to fit in better. We had just sat down in front of Rick's, one of the 2 bars in town, for some lemonade, when I spotted a boy in beat-up overalls come tearing down the road. He ran past us. I thought nothing of it until he ran back about a minute later, looking back and forth before running up to me. He asked me if I was a police officer. I told him yes I was. He told me his mama needed me to come help. His brother had gone missing. The lemonade would have to wait. I asked the boy for directions to his mama's house, then told him to run as fast as he could to the police station to get Sheriff Young to meet me there. The boy's name was Thomas Brindley. His mother, Margaret Brindley, was a widower and well-known artist in the town. Most of the town went to her for poster designs or hand-painted family portraits, and she'd even sold some of her pieces out of town. She lived in a lovely little pink house on Farmer Road, just off of Main Street, and she was just as lovely. When I knocked on her door and flashed my badge, however, her face was twisted with the kind of pain only a scared mother could have. She invited me inside, and within 15 minutes I was joined by Sheriff Young and Christian Woods with Thomas in tow. She explained to us that her son Luke, barely 11 years old, had gone with Thomas to play early in the morning after breakfast. She told them to be back by lunch, and had first started to worry when they didn't show up on time. She assumed at first that they had gone to buy a sandwich at Terwich Deli with Thomas's allowance. However, when the clock rolled to about 2 in the afternoon, she began to panic, and headed out to ask around the neighbors to see if Thomas and Luke were having a play date with their kids. She was at a complete loss after questioning the neighbors, until she took a deep breath and her hands trembled. Christian Woods put a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and she continued. Margaret was walking back down the street when she saw Thomas running back home. He was alone, his new overalls torn and dirty. That's when she called us. As his mother was tearfully explaining everything, little Thomas hadn't said a word. He was about 13 or so, and his matted brown hair covered his eyes as they stared off into nothing. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest. He didn't look up until Sheriff Young said his name. "Thomas," he said. The boy stared up at him with wide, dull eyes. Something about them was off-putting. "You need to tell us what happened." After a brief pause, the boy told us his story. His voice was flat and monotone, like he was daydreaming. "Luke and I went to go play in the woods, sir," he said. Sheriff Young sucked his teeth, and a strange look crossed his face. "We were playing cops and commies in the old lumberyard. But Luke cheated and I got mad. He stared down at the floorboards. Margaret and I watched with held breaths until he continued. I got mad and I told him I hated him and to go away, he said uncomfortably. Then he ran off crying into the woods. I was mad for a while, then I decided it was stupid and I tried to go find him. I called and tried to find him. Then I saw the owl man. A shiver went up my spine. Sheriff Young stared at Thomas like a statue. Describe him, he said flatly. He was tall, really tall, and had long arms with long fingers. He was between the trees like a big old branch, and he was holding Luke's hand. Margaret was now quietly sobbing onto Christian Woods. When I called his name, Luke looked back, and so did the man. He had big, wide, bright eyes and big feathers that spread from the outside of his face. When he saw me, he took Luke away. Took him away how? He got down on his hands and feet and arched his back like a cat. Then he scooped up Luke and ran quicker than the wind. I tried to follow, but I just wasn't quick enough. Then I ran home. There was silence in the living room, all except for the sniffling and weeping of Margaret Brindley. Thomas led us to the spot where he's last seen Luke, in the old lumber yard in Derbley Woods. The lumber yard, as well as the forest, once belonged to a very wealthy man by the name of Philip Derbley, hence the name. In the late 1700s, he had a number of about 15 or so slaves working for him in the lumberyard, selling it to the surrounding counties until a bloody slave revolt led to his and their deaths. As a result, you can imagine that Derbley Woods didn't have the best reputation, and it had certainly earned it. The place was eerie, with a strange quiet that seemed to grow deeper the further you went into it. As we started to search the woods, calling Luke's name, Thomas's story played in my head over and over again. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves put my hairs on end. Christian Woods and I were twitchier than thieves in a cymbal factory. Sheriff Young was as stoic as always. The three of us searched until the sun went down, and hours into the night with flashlights. The next morning we recruited the town. All together in a line we searched through those woods for a good 2 days before Sheriff Young finally called in the state police. Sheriff Young wasn't a fan of the state police, and they weren't a fan of Goody as a whole. But we dug for 3 days without even so much as a clue as to where the boy had gone off to, so we had no choice. When the state police showed, it was with a pretty paltry procession. A dozen men and a couple of sniffer hounds joined us. The search lasted a brief 2 days longer before the state police up and left. They kept muttering about getting strange headaches and seeing weird things in those woods, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Didn't help that not one of the sniffer hounds even set paw further than the lumberyard, keening and pulling away as they approached the tree line. In the end, we gave up a few days later, much to our regret and to Margaret's grief. Little Luke had just been up and swallowed whole by Derbley Woods and the Owl Man. A little less than a year later, during the beginning of Jerry Jr.'s mental problems, a lead popped up again that sparked another investigation. I was taking a walk around the outskirts of Derbley Woods with Mammoth, Susanna's dog. I was a little bit wound up, as I'd had my first encounter with a devil eye that morning, so the walk was doing me some good. I was walking past the tree line when I heard singing coming from the woods. I slowed my walk to try and listen. At first it was faint, but as I listened, the singing became clearer. I'm not sure exactly what the words were, but I'll write them as I heard them sound. "Lo, my doe to die," it echoed. I stopped in my tracks, intrigued. "Hello?" I called into the woods. A moment later, the singer answered again. "Lo, my doe to die," it said. The voice was strange. It was warbling and deep, like whoever was singing it was yawning with their mouth too far open. Mammoth started whining and pulling at the leash. "Who's out there?" I called. "Mackie?" "Lo, my doe to die," it answered. The singing sounded throatier now, angrier. I heard rustling in the trees. Mammoth was going crazy, tugging at the leash with his teeth. "Lo, my doe to die," it shouted. Something was crashing through the trees now, angry and howling those words in that strange rhythm. Lo my do to die. It was close. I scrambled to pull my Model 10 from its holster and pointed it where the singing was coming from. Once more it pounded in my eardrums, every syllable like a bellow. Something came loping out of the woods, something with long legs and wide, bright eyes. Lo my do to die, it roared. I fired twice. There was a piercing scream, like a woman's. I didn't stop to see if my shots had worked. I turned right the hell around and beat it like a bat out of hell, Mammoth barking the whole way back to town. When I came to a halt at the police station, Mackie and Christian Wood stared at me like I'd seen the devil. For all I knew, I had. After I calmed down, I told them what I saw. Within an hour, we were back at that spot with shotguns and revolvers. We patrolled the woods for an hour, and I was shaking the whole time. I knew what I'd seen. The Owl Man. As Thomas had seen almost a year ago, we didn't find a damn thing, as you might guess. And believe me, I didn't want to look much closer. For a while, I only walked Mammoth in town. I didn't hear or see the Owl Man again. Now that would have been the end of the story if it didn't rear its head a good 3 or so years later. At that point, I actually was the titular sheriff of Goody, Maine, and I'd long forgotten the Luke Brindley case. Thomas was 17, and his mother had finally moved on. Life was as normal as it could be in Goody. I was sitting behind my desk when Patrick Graham, though we called him Cookie, came stumbling into my office, bright red and sweating. After trying and failing to calm down, he gestured wildly at the door, and I figured he wanted me to follow him. We drove like hell down Main Street down to the lumberyard. There, a couple of folks stockpiling lumber for the winter were sitting on some stumps waiting for us. With them was a face that nearly made me spit my coffee. Luke Brindley was sitting happy as a gopher on the ground. I was dumbfounded. Luke had been gone for 3 years, and yet here he was, the picture of health. His clothes were clean, looked well-fed and content. My hands were shaking as I called Dr. Lautner and told him to get a bed ready. Then I called Margaret Brindley. She didn't believe me at first. Who would? I explained to her everything as best as I could when the incredulity shattered, and the weeping of an ecstatic mother came pouring through. I didn't have all the answers, hell, I barely had any, but I told her to come and wait at the clinic until Dr. Lautner had finished checking up on him. The wait was excruciating for both Margaret and I. She had rushed over, her hair a mess and her makeup half done, and had brought her son along with her. Whatever concern I had for Luke shifted to Thomas. The boy looked seriously unwell. He sat with his hands tight on his lap, clasped together. He was deathly pale and sweating despite the air conditioning of the clinic waiting room. I don't know how I'd take to hearing my brother missing for 3 years was alive and well, but that sure as hell wasn't it. I knelt down beside him and asked him if he was all right. His voice was a trembling whisper, barely even trying to sound normal. Fine, he said. About half an hour later, Dr. Lautner walked in with Luke in tow. His smile looked forced, but not Luke's. He was wide-eyed and smiling. Margaret wailed and collapsed to her knees when she finally held her baby boy once again. I should have been touched, been weeping along with her, but the way Dr. Lautner looked told me he didn't felt the same way. Something was totally amiss, but none of us dared try to ruin the moment. The entire time his mother held him, Luke stared with that happy, empty look at his brother. Thomas never returned the stare. I didn't sleep that night. Questions pummeled my brain and kept me awake. How the devil had the boy survived 3 years in Derbley Woods without so much as a scratch or a bruise? How had his clothes stayed so clean? And there was one question that burned hotter than the others because I didn't dare consider it. Why did little Luke Brindley look like he hadn't aged a day since he vanished? Eventually the questions drove me out of bed, and I decided to do a late-night patrol through Goody. I drove slowly through the streets, questions buzzing like hornets, and that familiar coldness in my gut. It was 3 a.m. when I drove past the pretty pink house the Brindleys still lived in. The lights were still on. I walked up the driveway and knocked on the door. I asked if everything was all right. I knocked 3 times and didn't hear any answer. My heart was pounding in my chest and I didn't know why, so I opened the door. It was unlocked. The house was dead quiet. The lights were on in the living room, and the TV was tuned to static with no one watching. Something was terribly wrong. I put my hand on my revolver when I heard shuffling coming from upstairs. I crept up the steps, and my heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest when I stepped in something sticky. I looked down. The steps were caked in blood. I drew my gun. Blood trailed down to the end of the hall, to the bathroom. The door was open. Something was hunched on the floor. Something with legs that stretched too long and bent too many times. Something with arms that ended in 2 claws. It was eating something on the ground. It was limp and red and looked an awful lot like Thomas Brindley. When I clicked back the hammer of my revolver, it turned its head like an owl. Its face was upside down. The thing that was Luke Brindley unhinged its jaw and sang, "Lo my do to die." I fired twice. It missed. The damn thing moved too fast, lanky like a marionette. It dove through the window, howling and screaming that damn song. For a moment, I hesitated between giving chase and staying. Then I ran to Thomas and called for backup, doing my best to stop the flow of blood. In the distance, the thing that was Luke Brindley screamed into the night as it galloped back to the woods. "Lo my do to die." I still hear that song sometimes, in my worst nightmares. Thomas survived, thank God, but sometimes I wish he hadn't. His jaw had been ripped clean out of his skull, and his tongue had been pulled out. As for Margaret, we found her out cold in Luke's bedroom, thankfully unscathed. She was never the same after that night, and as for me, well, it was nothing a week of drinking couldn't solve. It was the tried and true method that kept me going through most of the years at Goody, until my liver started acting up. We never did find that damn owlman again, but one day we got a call from some hikers who claimed they found a body in Derbley Wood, about a mile from the lumberyard. Hidden beneath a rotted-out corpse was a small, huddled skeleton. Dr. Lautner guessed it would have belonged to an 11-year-old boy, long dead in that hole beneath the trees. Thomas never spoke again, and spent the rest of his life eating through tubes and never setting foot outside. Though Margaret told me that sometimes, in the dead of night when he thinks she's asleep, she sees him staring out the window towards the woods, mumbling something. Some kind of song.